Good evening. Welcome to Indiana University's Cinema's virtual screening room. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that IU Cinema is built and operates on the ancestral lands of the indigenous people of the Miami, Potawatomi, Delaware, and Shawnee nations. My name is Jessica Davis-Tagg, and I am the Events and Operations Director at IU Cinema. On behalf of the entire IU Cinema team, we'd like to thank you for being here tonight for this Jorgensen Guest Filmmaker discussion with writer and director Hugo Perez, along with Indiana University Associate Professor Joan Hawkins. We will start with a conversation between our guests, and about 45 minutes in, we will start answering audience questions. Please feel free to begin typing questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time, which you can reach by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program is the second event in the Hugo Perez All That Still Matters at All series, presented in partnership with the Writers Guild of Bloomington program as part of IU Cinema's Creative Collaborations program. We'd like to thank Joan Hawkins for curating and coordinating the series. Joan is an associate professor of cinema and media studies in the Media School at Indiana University and the chair of the Writers Guild at Bloomington. She's published extensively on horror cinema, experimental, and independent cinema. As a creative writer, Joan writes and performs spoken word memoir and creative nonfiction. Please join me in welcoming Joan Hawkins.
Thank you, Jessica. So I have a long list of people to thank. The Writers Guild at Bloomington, again, with a special shout out to my friend and colleague, Tony Brewer, IU Cinema, the Ove V. Jorgensen Foundation, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Center for Documentary Research and Practice, Cinema and Media Studies, the Media School, IU Hillel, the Hungarian Cultural Association, the Hungarian Studies Program, Inter-Asian and Uralic National Resource Center, Bourne's Jewish Studies Program, the Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies, the Black Film Center Archive, and African Studies in the Departments of Spanish and Portuguese, English and African American and African Diaspora Studies. And we'd also like to thank IU Press. So Hugo Perez is a filmmaker and writer. Hopefully we're here on Tuesday and we had an opportunity to see his wonderful documentary, Neither Memory Nor Magic. He's a filmmaker and writer whose work often focuses on his Cuban heritage. He is the recipient of the 2009 Estela Award for Documentary Filmmaking, presented by the National Association of Latino Independent Producers. In 2008, he was the recipient of the prestigious Rockefeller Foundation Tribeca Film Institute Emerging Artist Fellowship in support of his feature screenplay, Immaculate Conception. In 2008, he was also spotlighted as a success story in the Chivas Regal Spirit of Success advertising campaign. His short film, Betty Laflacca, which I think we're going to see parts of tonight, was the winner of the 2006 New York Latino Film Festival Short Film Award, and it was broadcast on HBO. Perez's previous short film, Julieta y Ramon, was broadcast as part of the 2005 Showtime Latino Filmmaker Showcase, which spotlights the work of emerging Latino directors, and it was broadcast on the PBS series Real New York. Neither Memory Nor Magic, which we screened on Tuesday, was the recipient of the Chairman's Award of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And his most recent film is Once Upon a Time in Uganda. As a writer, Perez has studied writing with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, collaborated with Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist William Kennedy, and served as a guest artist for acclaimed theater director and artist Robert Wilson. And his writing has been featured in the New York Times Magazine and Salon, and his films have screened at venues such as MoMA and the Smithsonian. So please, please, please join me in welcoming Hugo Perez.
Good evening. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Indiana University Cinema. I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. I wish it could be in person, but hopefully that day will come soon when I get to visit you guys. So tonight's lecture or talk or conversation is titled Portrait of the Artist as a Cuban Filmmaker. And I am that Cuban filmmaker. Now, sometimes when I tell people that I'm Cuban, there's a little hesitation, and then I get a question. And the question is, are both your parents Cuban? And really what people are asking is like, are you really Cuban? You know, because apparently I don't fit into the box that people think of. I don't look like Che Guevara, and so, you know, I'm questionable. It's interesting because that usually only happens, you know, kind of in non-Latino circles. Whenever I travel in Latin America, everybody, you know, where cultural identity, like, you know, spans the whole rainbow of black to white, you know, people are more used to having Cubans that, you know, look like me. Let me tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in Miami and in the 70s and the 80s. I was a kid. I went to Cuban Catholic school for 12 years. I went to the same high school as Fidel Castro. It was a Jesuit high school. As soon as he came into power, for some reason, he kicked the Jesuits out of Cuba. And so I went to the same school in Miami. Yeah, and when I was growing up, Miami was an entirely Cuban city. I remember that in those 12 years of Catholic school, there was one non-Cuban kid I went to school with, Edward Zayset. I still remember his name because he was the only one. Yeah, and so you grew up, I mean, it was like growing up in a foreign country. As a matter of fact, at school, alongside the US anthem, national anthem, we would also sing the Cuban anthem in Spanish every single day. So you grew up really, you know, with the idea that you were Cuban, even though we were in the United States. My parents had come over from Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. They were in exile from Cuba, but there was always this idea that the stay in the United States was temporary, and that someday we would all go back to Cuba. So that's part of, you know, the way that I was brought up. And it was kind of, you know, also, I mean, we grew up feeling very Cuban, but when we watched TV, there weren't a lot of Cubans on TV. So the one Cuban that there was Ricky Ricardo. I think we all watch I Love Lucy, right? So because of Ricky Ricardo, you know, I feel like wearing a smoking jacket or a tuxedo is just what one has to do. I mean, I didn't put on this jacket just for you guys. I mean, it's just because Ricky Ricardo brought us up to believe that gentlemen should wear a smoking jacket every night. Anyway, he was the one Cuban that was on TV. And so, you know, so culturally it was kind of a weird kind of growing up because, you know, so I was reading Marvel Comics and watching PBS, which is how I learned English. English is my second language. I started kindergarten not knowing a word of English. You know, but at the same time, you know, at home, we grew up in like a very, you know, Spanish speaking, it's very Cuban community. So some, you know, very early on, I had, you know, kind of like an interesting, I don't know, cultural experience, like bring the two cultures together. On top of that, you know, from childhood, I've been an avid reader, kind of a book nerd. I had a subscription to the Miami Herald when I was 6. The newspaper was bigger than I was, and I would read it, the entire thing, cover to cover every day. Some days the paper wasn't delivered, and I remember like being an angry 7-year-old and calling the newspaper and saying, my paper was not delivered today. I was also a big fan of Sherlock Holmes. You know, so I was living in, I mean, I was living in Miami in this Cuban community, but I was also living in these other worlds at the same time. At the same time, you know, my grandmother, you know, she raised me with all these stories about her family history in Cuba. And she would tell me these stories about all the men in my family that had fought for Cuban independence, going back to the War of 1868. So one of her bedtime stories for me was the story of her great grandfather, Julio Grave de Peralta, who was a hero of the War of Independence in 1868. He was running guns to the freedom fighters, and when encountering a Spanish battalion, they killed all his men. He was the last man standing, and he was given the opportunity of surrendering or dying. And he said, "I prefer death," and thus became a martyr to Cuban independence. And in Cuban culture, martyrdom, I mean, as in other cultures, something to be aspired to. And so this was like my bedtime story. My grandmother would tell me frequently was like about how this honorable man, preferred dying rather than surrendering.
Did they tell you how you came to the United States? How they came to the United States?
What's that?
Did they tell you how they came to the United States or why they came to the United States?
Yeah. Well, they came over in the 60s. And at that time, it was a little complicated. They couldn't get visas directly into the US. So they went to Mexico City where there was family. And it was, this is kind of very complicated time. And eventually they made it to New York City, which is where I was born. I spent the first years of my life in New York. So I'm New Yorker by birth, and New York is where I live now. It was, I don't know if people listening here, some may be Cuban or some may have family experiences where revolutions happen, and basically they had to leave everything behind. They had to leave behind their homes, they had to leave behind some of their family, and start new lives in this country. And so from an early age, it's interesting because, I mean, we're living in a very dramatic time right now. But I feel in some ways growing up with the story of my family having, their world was upended by what happened to them. And so I grew up with this understanding that no matter how secure you may feel, that things can change dramatically. Anyway, so yes, I was, I was very much brought up with a sense of, the old world and what they had lost. And had some understanding of how hard they worked, to kind of, I don't know, to provide a life for us. My father was a bartender, so he didn't have higher education. I remember as a kid, I would go after school. I would go over to the bar that he worked at, and he would set me up at the bar with like a Coke and French fries. And so I'd just be sitting there. He'd give me a booth. Sometimes I'd have a booth at the bar. And so I'd take my friends. And this is like a different era. I'm not sure if this would be okay today. But back then it was, I just bike up, walk through the kitchen into the bar, and then they'd set me up with a Coke. And then and all the clients, this would be in the afternoon, and the bar, there'd be all these kind of Cubans of my parents' generation drinking there. Well, I thought it was really cute that I would go and drink Coke while my dad was bartending. Anyway, so I grew up in this kind of, in a very, when I watch Fellini's movies and I want, he was, were made in the 50s. Sometimes I feel like growing up in Miami in the 80s, we were like 30 years behind the times. It was really like a kind of throwback moment. So I feel like I grew up 60 years ago because everything was kind of so sleepy and so old school and so old world. Anyway, so I went through my schooling. I got into Yale. I was very good in science, and so I was going to be an engineer. But then right before I went to Yale, I saw a Charlie Chaplin Film Festival on Turner Classic Movies. Just one night, City Lights was on, and I fell in love with Chaplin. And then for a week, every night I watched pretty much the entire canon. And after that week, I thought to myself, I think I want to try this. I think I want to try and make film. So I went to Yale. There was not a film department because at the time, the feeling at Yale was that Yale is not a trade school. So why would we teach filmmaking? So we had to be like underground when we would make films. And I spent a lot of my first year at Yale studying silent cinema and decided I want to make silent films, and that I would star in them. And so I made a series of 3 or 4 silent film shorts. You know, people had cameras that I'd borrow. There was one editing deck. It was all in video. There was one editing deck. It was in this room across from a laundry room in a basement. And we would basically break in at night when we knew nobody was in there. And this room was so poorly maintained that there was a broken window. So like one corner of the room was filled with leaves, and sometimes there were squirrels living in the edit room. So anyway, so I often tell people that I got my start in the silent film era, which is true but it was my own private silent film era that I created for myself. So back then, we weren't shooting on film because we didn't have access to that. We were shooting, and here's a prop. We were shooting on VHS tapes. I don't know, some of you may remember these.
Yeah,
This is magnetic tape. Look how big this thing is, right? So this is what we were shooting on. And anyway, can we show slide 1? I just want to give you just a little taste of, yeah, see, so this is me when I was an undergrad at Yale. This is from a short film I made called Stacks. It was about a guy that worked at the Yale Library. And, you know, I mean, I look like I'm 12 years old in this. I was telling Joan earlier that it's funny because I lived with all these football players when I was an undergrad at Yale. And so whenever they were throwing a party, for some reason, I mean, they all like were 6 foot tall and had beards, but some reason they would ask me to go to the liquor store to buy the kegs. Because they thought because I wore a smoking jacket that I seemed older, which I think is not true. Like I can't imagine this guy at the liquor store who didn't ask for my ID, but was happy to sell me a keg. You know. Anyway, that has nothing to do with filmmaking. I just thought it added a little color. So this particular film, Stacks, we never got permits for anything or permission. And so I was working at the library at the time, and we would break into the library at night to film. And so the way we would do that is there were these manhole covers on the Yale campus that would lead into the steam tunnels. And so we'd pick up a manhole cover, we'd climb underground into a steam tunnel, you know, close the grate behind us, and then we'd go through the steam tunnel and come up in the library, and then we'd shoot till like 4 or 5 in the morning, and then we'd come back out, list the manhole cover. That was really still to this day one of my favorite film experiences ever. Anyway, yeah, it was a fun experience, and we can remove the slide now, and we're back.
Actually, some of the students who are viewing this might have fond memories of the building that we used to be in when we were in communication and culture. We were over in this old abandoned dormitory, and we had feral cats in our building, but we also had the anatomy lab. That's where they had the cadavers, and so there was every night there were students breaking into the anatomy lab to make their student projects.
You know, it was a kind of different time. I think today, you know, if I mean, most places are trying to do this, you know, campus security would come and it would be like a big deal. Back then, it was kind of anything goes as long as you didn't hurt yourself or other people.
Especially since you were breaking into the library. Maybe if you'd been breaking in someplace else, they would have gotten exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the feeling then was that, you know, I mean, that as Yale undergrad, I mean, there's a tradition in the Ivy League that you basically, you know, as long as you don't really hurt anything, like you're kind of allowed to do a lot of stuff. Anyway, so I had a great time at Yale making silent films, and but also taking classes because that's what one does. And I had some really great weird classes that I took. There was a professor named Gregory Crudson, and he taught a class called Constructed Reality. Now, a few of you may know who Gregory Crudson is. He's become kind of a rock star fine art photographer. He has a show right now up at Gagosian in Los Angeles. I mean, you know, he's pretty amazing. But back then, he was just this kind of like cool, weird dude who taught this class, Constructed Reality, that nobody could quite figure out. Can we show slide number 2? So this is one of Greg's photos from the 90s, part of a series called Twilight. Now, the idea of constructed reality is that, you know, you kind of create a world and take a picture, you know, so it's as if it was an off-the-cuff photo, but there's a whole narrative. I mean, this photo that we're looking at is kind of this noir suburban take on Jack and the Beanstalk. And I was lucky enough, this is after I graduated from Yale, and I lived close to where Greg was living and photographing at the time, so I was able to be on set for this photo. And it's amazing, and this took, you know, an entire day, or a couple of days actually. You know, they dug up that front yard, they created the beanstalk. The day of, they brought the prop car, they had lights on cranes. This is shot on a 10 by 12 camera. And then, you know, it was kind of racing to get this photo done. They shot it right at that kind of twilight hour. And so, you know, from Greg, it was, you know, I started to learn, you know, the amount of construction that whether you're making documentary, whether you're making fiction, whatever your medium is, you know, just how much construction goes into kind of creating a reality. You know, it was something that I started to understand when I was a student at Yale, and that, you know, over the last several decades, I've come to understand much better. We can leave that slide.
So when you were studying with him, did you take a class specifically on constructed reality, or was that just something that came up in
No, the class
in
was
general?
called Constructed Reality.
That's a great name for a class.
Yeah, and we really, you know, I have to say that it took me, I didn't quite get it. I mean, it was very cool. He was I mean, he is an incredibly cool guy. I mean, if you Google him and you find out who his friends are, the people that collect him, I mean, he's really, you know, he was a cool guy, but at that time we had no idea how cool he was. And he was just, you know, we had this class in the basement of the Art and Architecture building, and, you know, it was kind of a labyrinth to get down to this, like, this little dungeon room where we had our class, and he would just show us slides and show us weird films like Todd Haynes' Superstar.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, his very first movie, where he told the Karen Carpenter story with Barbie dolls, which is to this day is still a bootleg film. So we watched a bootleg VHS of that, but we do slideshows of Cindy Sherman's work. We look at David Lynch. Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, just the influences he kind of pulled in, and we may not have fully understood what he was getting at, but I think we all appreciated that, you know, he was taking us into this, you know, kind of magical world, or this, you know, this altered reality. Anyway, you know, so I was lucky. I got to, you know, I went to Yale. I didn't have the typical Yale experience. I never took Vincent Scully, the famous art historian. I feel sad about that, but I got to make silent movies. I got to take classes with kind of weird, cool artists. So I graduated from Yale, and you know, I'd never been to Cuba. You know, and at that time it was a dicey proposition. I mean, there were flights, but it was very restricted. It was very fraught with emotion. You know, my father passed away, and a few years after he passed away, I finally decided I got to go. I gotta get to know the homeland. And so I went. I told my mom I was going to Colombia and that I was going to be in the mountains with gorillas and that I wouldn't be able to call her. And she's like, okay, that's fine. Because if I had told her I was going to go to Cuba, she would have flipped out. But it was okay that I was, I mean, I literally told her, yeah, I may be up in the mountains with the gorillas, and so I won't be able to call you. And she's like, okay, that's fine. You know, I don't think she fully understood what I was saying, but if I had said Cuba. So anyway, so I called up my aunt, who I'd met before, and I said, hey, I'm coming. Um, I'll give you a call when I get in. And so I got to Cuba. I show up at the airport, which at that time was like a military airport, and there's military officers that they didn't interrogate you, but they definitely, they gave you that look, that kind of stern, like we could put you in jail kind of look. Everything's fine. I went through, and there was a guy I had never met in my life, standing there with a sign with my name on it, and he sees me and he starts to like scream and wave, and so I go over, and it's one of my cousins. I'd never met my cousin Carlos. He had brought his wife and his kids and his stepfather in a 1954 Chevy to meet me at the airport. Now, they didn't know what flight I was coming in on, so they just went for the day to wait, just as and they had a picture of me, and I was like, just wait. My aunt had said, wait for him. That became a whole, that trip was a whole experience. I won't say too much. I'll say, I mean, we could talk for a while about it, but I'll just say two things about that trip. One is, at one point we went back to visit my grandparents' house, where my father was born. And so these two women that had taken, were basically the housekeepers. They were still alive and they still lived next to the old house. One of them, the younger one, was 70. She was the daughter, and her mother was 100. They had no idea my father, my uncle, and my grandparents had passed away. And then we told them, and they started to cry. And then the 100-year-old woman who used to work for my grandparents, she was half blind, and she pulled my face close to hers, and she looked at me with her one good eye. She's like, oh, you look just like your dad. And then her 70-year-old daughter took me out to like a little vegetable garden, little patch of dirt. And she pointed to it and she said, this is where your father was born.
Oh my God.
So I got to see literally the patch of earth where my father was born. Anyway, it was very powerful. I had a camera with me, but it was, maybe somebody else could have made a film about that trip, but the mediation was too much. I needed to experience it. And but one thing that happened on that trip was it turns out that my cousins in Cuba were just as nerdy about books as I was. And it was kind of amazing because none of my cousins on my mom's side of the family are here in the States. They're not into books, and I met my cousins in Cuba, and they're all into books, really into books. And so we'd spend long hours talking about books and about Hemingway. And I found out that Hemingway's boat captain in Cuba, Gregorio Fuentes, was still alive. He was at the time like 98 or 99. And I thought, how great would it be to meet him? And maybe I could make some kind of a little film about him. And so I didn't do it on that trip, but I came back, I don't know, 6 months later. And I brought my friend Chuck Moss, who's a cameraman, or he wanted to come anyway. We were spending like a month kind of hanging out, and we went, and we went to the fishing village where the Old Man and the Sea is set, and we asked around, and they said, oh yeah, Gregorio, like he lives over there. Just go and knock on his door. And so we showed up. We happened to have our equipment with us, and so we knock on the door, and we walk in, and we meet Hemingway's boat captain. And he was 98 or 99, not a big guy, but he had huge hands, really big hands. And when I shook his hand, like his hand crushed my hand. It was, and it was like, yeah, this guy spent a lifetime hauling in like 500-pound marlin. Yeah. And at 98, he still had that grip. And it was like this kind of I was like, this is, it was kind of amazing.
Yeah.
This kind of like, touching this guy that was like right out of a Hemingway book. So within 20 minutes, he's like, oh, if you want to interview me, I'm like, sure, let's do it now. So, so we did this interview, and that interview that we did, within, the first hour of meeting, this person served as the backbone for my short documentary, The Old Man and Hemingway.
Right.
So maybe this would be
Yeah,
a good
yeah.
opportunity. And this is basically my first short documentary. So can we, 7 minutes long. We'll be back in 7 minutes.
Vives como recuerdo entre marea y espuma. Yo sé que nos veremos entre Mariel y Tortuga.
El pescado nunca ha tenido buena vida. El que ha sabido conquistarla coge buenas condiciones para vivir. Porque yo la he cogido, porque yo me pueden llevar a cualquier lugar en el mar. Si no tengo esas condiciones, nadie me llama.
Baila con las sirenas, que es bueno para la cintura. Vives en las leyendas y en cada loca aventura.
Un hombre humano, con un corazón humano, para todo el mundo. Ese era el señor Hemingway.
Oh mío, Yemaya, 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 Yemaya lode. Oh mío, Yemaya, Yemaya lode. Cuando el río y el mar se encuentran, Yemaya, tú estás en el medio para bendecir a los cubanos que te extrañamos. Oh mío, Yemaya.
Y entonces al llegar ahí el tiempo estaba muy malo. Y veo que estaban llamándome. Y yo miré y era una lancha que estaba al garete, que no tenía gasolina para caminar. Y me llamaba para que lo auxiliara. Y entonces en ese momento, cuando llego yo allí, y le di el remolque y entró junto conmigo. ¿Y ahora qué vamos a hacer? Me dice. Digo, no se ocupe, aquí estoy yo. Aquí comen, almuerzan y toman. Y entonces el barco vino donde estaban ellos. Y él lo único que me dice, adiós. Cuando usted rinda su viaje, en Cuba los veremos, porque yo voy a Cuba. Dice, si usted quiere ser mi capitán, yo estoy haciendo un barco que ya está listo. Y yo, sí, como que no. Y fue así. Y de aquí salíamos y volvíamos a entrar aquí mismo. Y de aquí él cogía su máquina y se iba para su casa y yo me venía para aquí.
Oh mío, Yemaya, Yemaya lode. Cuando el río y el mar se encuentran, Yemaya, tú estás en el medio para bendecir a los cubanos que te extrañamos.
Mientras él estaba aquí, todos los días salíamos a pescar, siendo el verano, empezando julio, junio, agosto, septiembre, octubre, porque él estaba pescando abajo, sentado en el barco, pero yo estaba arriba manejando y cuando yo vi la aguja yo la avisaba con el pie y él enseguida atendía y la vi, y era verdad. No hay cosas que cree en el mundo que estamos hablando, no, estamos atendiendo a la pesca. Él miraba y yo miraba. Y él cuando no la veía yo, y cuando no la veía yo, la veía él. Él pega, que venía a comer a la carnada. Ahí nosotros ya no se podía salir más a pescar, hasta que no viniera otra vez el verano. La última vez fue aquí en el 60, aquí sentado hablando yo aquí, diciéndome él, cuida el barco como tú lo has sabido cuidar. Y cuídate tú también igual. Y yo pensando en aquello, ¿qué querrá decirme que cuide el barco? ¿Qué querrá hacer? No se salió más a pescar. Desde que murió no salí con nadie. Ni en el barco ni con otro. Yo no salí más a pescar. Han querido que yo fuera, pero digo que yo no. Pues tengo muy viejo ya y muy cansado. ¿Para qué? No necesito pescar. Nosotros no estuviéramos aquí tampoco, ni él ni yo, estuviéramos pescando.
Seguro estuvieron con esta mano. Dice que si estuvieran, no estuvieran ahí. Estuvieran ahí.
Aguántate, que el viento me...
I think we're back, right?
We are. So you credited Albert Maisel in the end scroll. Did he help you in any way with the film?
Well, I'm glad you brought up Albert, because many things happened after I graduated from college, like going to Cuba for the first time. I started to do some work for the New York State Writers Institute and working with novelist William Kennedy on a series of portraits of writers and poets. I'll get back to that in a second. I met Albert Maisels 1998 at the Film Forum in New York at a double bill of Salesman and Gimme Shelter.
Oh, yeah.
Very familiar with those
Very
films.
amazing, yeah.
I had never seen them, so you can imagine seeing those for the first time in a double bill with Albert there to tell stories, and also Charlotte Zorin, who had edited both of those films. And anyway, Albert was a one-man film school in New York City. For those of you that don't know, Albert is one of the pioneers of American documentary filmmaking. And he and his brother David, created some of the greatest American documentaries. And they had a studio on 54th Street. And so after the screening, I went up and said hello. And he gave me his card and he said, "Hey, call me, come by the office." And so I was like, sure. So I called him up and he said, he said, "Come by." And so we set a meeting and I came in thinking it would be 15 minutes. And my friend Chuck and I went and he spent 4 hours in the screening room showing us clips of all the films and basically like giving us a 4-hour lesson on Maisel's films.
Wow.
And I think because I was Cuban, he had been in Cuba in 1959 and had filmed with Fidel when I was 60. He, with Drew Associates, made a film called Yankee No, and he'd always wanted to go back. And I think because I think he'd always wanted to go back to Cuba, and he befriended me and my friend Chuck, and I think we reminded him of him and his brother. And so I got very close to him very quickly. I mean, a lot of people did. He was a great guy, but I cooked a couple of dinners at his apartment, and we talked about doing a project in Cuba together. And then when I was making The Old Man and Hemingway, he took a look at a cut and gave me a little bit of feedback. And I just wanted to thank him for inspiration more than anything else. 'Cause when I saw Salesman, it was, it was a revelation. It was, what they were trying to do with Salesman was what Truman Capote did for nonfiction writing with In Cold Blood, which is create like kind of the nonfiction novel in documentary film. And they succeeded. And to this day, he was, one of the last times I saw him, he was saying, David Mamet, when he met Albert, he said, when I saw Salesman, I realized that's what I was trying to do with Glengarry Glen Ross. That was like Glengarry Glen Ross. Yeah. Anyway, so Albert was an inspiration that kind of nudged me in the direction of nonfiction, because up to that point, I was, I was really going to plunge into fiction and to narrative, and that really kind of pushed me in the direction of documentary, just seeing those films and being aware of just the possibilities.
Hugo, I should warn you about time. We have about 15 minutes before we turn to the audience.
Okay, then I'm going to go very quickly through a lot of stuff.
Okay.
So anyway, The Old Man Hemingway premiered at MoMA 2002. Around that time, I was starting to, I worked on documentaries. I started to make narrative shorts. My first narrative short was Julieta Ramon. And I would say I was very influenced by growing up in Miami, because when I was growing up in Miami, Ronald Reagan was revered by everyone. Yeah. And so the main character in Julieta Ramon, Julieta, has a sexual fetish for Ronald Reagan. And, it's about her. She wants a guy that has a foot fetish. And we So this is a still from the film. In her bedroom, she's got this whole shrine to Reagan, and she finds it hard to, like the guys that come over, they get freaked out when she starts to ask them to say, tear down this wall. Anyway, so, and can we show slide 4? Oh yeah, see, so she has all these pictures of Reagan and she's cut out her face and put it over Nancy's face. Anyway, that would, that was a fun, that was my first short film. I got to, weave some of that, some of the kind of weird, funny culture of growing up Cuban in Miami into it. I made it with my friend Andreas Wagner. Onel Moulet, who made the music for The Old Man and Hemingway, also did the music for this film, which we're not showing tonight. We don't have time. Anyway, and there's also, I should note that I was rejected by the first 15 festivals I sent it to. The first one that accepted it was the New York Latino Film Festival. And one of the screeners for that festival was a woman, Sandra Avila, who worked at Showtime and who was programming the Showtime Latino Filmmaker Showcase. And so I was rejected by all these festivals, but after my first festival, I basically was selected to be part of this Showtime program. So that was, it's just keep going. You get a lot of no's, but sometimes you get a yes, and the yeses are pretty nice. Yeah, I got a text from somebody who's a friend of Sandra's. Anyway, so then around that time, I started to work on a film, Neither Memory Nor Magic, that we screened the other night, about the Hungarian poet Miklós Radnóti. And at the same time that as I was finishing that film, I won this award from HBO for my script, Betty Laflacca. So Betty Laflacca is an absurd little comedy that we're going to see in a minute, but it's based on documentary reality. At that time in New York, and I guess still to this day probably, there are all these illegal clinics in people's homes in the Bronx where they would do plastic surgery. And butt enlargement was a relatively new thing back then. It's much more popular today. But back then, these women would go to somewhere in the Bronx into an apartment building, and they would have liquid silicone injected to give them a more rounded shape. And so I saw comedic possibilities in this, and then I wrote the script, and so I was doing this Holocaust movie, but then at the same time making this comedy about big butts. Anyway, so maybe we should just watch it.
Betty! I'm home! Honey, I'm hungry. Did you cook?
Así lo es. See you, Reina. Bye, Flaca. Chao.
Ay, mami, pero es que Carlos is not into me.
Let me tell you something. 10 years ago, yo estaba así. I was a stick, a toothpick. I got work done.
So this is not yours?
Well, it is now.
Carlos likes women like you.
Mira, mami. You need to go see Maria Dolores. She runs a clinic out of her apartment. Because, mamita, tú estás muy flaca, you know? And carne is where it's at. When she's done with you, Carlos, he's gonna be eating out of the palm of your hand.
María Dolores, Reina me habló de sus servicios.
Tenemos buena estructura para trabajar esto. ¿Y qué quiere?
Pues como...
Un momentito. Tenemos el J-Lo, el Beyoncé por acá muy bonito, la Iricha.
Mira, ¿estoy seguro?
Bueno, seguro como la vida misma. Lo único que te voy a decir es, mira, después de este procedimiento, tiene que estar acotadita así en tu barriguita por 2 horas, porque si no después el silicón se daña. Vamos a ver qué linda te ves. Ok, después de esto... Tengo que ir. Pero mira, acuérdate, acotadita por mínimo 1 hora. Y la próxima vez cuando regreses, mira, te balanceamos un poquito arriba, ¿ok?
Hey, get back here!
También, ¿sabes? Yo traigo lo que me saca a mí de los cojones. Coño, esta silla yo la traigo para acá, para la casa. No sé cuál es el problema. ¿Cuántos se han encarnado en esta silla?
Get your lazy ass off the bed and make me unos huevos bien fritico, mi amor.
Betty! Ay, ay, ay. Oh my God, you look so...
Y rapidito, mi amor.
I see, but whatever you want to bring it back.
Le habla Betty. Por favor, necesito otra cita, llámeme.
So yeah, so that was Betty Laflacca, which obviously is an absurd little comedy, but it is based on a documentary reality. And I guess since we have limited time, I'm going to start to try and connect all the dots. What is the connects, like the Holocaust to Big Butts in the Bronx. And growing up in Miami, I was brought up in equal measure with a lot of melodrama. I mean, both real life melodrama and also the soap operas my mom would watch. So I have a fine appreciation for melodrama, but also there's a lot of humor, and there's a lot of ribald humor that, you know, life wasn't easy a lot of times when I was a kid. I didn't realize, you know, just how hard it was on my parents until later, because everybody was always laughing. Like when the family would get together, you know, they would tell absurd stories, and we just spent a lot of time laughing. And it was a kind of, I don't know. And so I think, so I guess that's where a lot of, and also, you know, from my grandmother, an appreciation of history. And that's where a lot of my interest in documentary and the documentary subjects that I've chosen comes in, is to like dig up these great characters or these great moments in history that maybe people don't know about. So Gregorio Fuentes, Hemingway's boat captain, and then later Miklós Radnóti, the Hungarian poet. I'm drawn to, you know, to subjects who are involved in the arts or in crafting fiction. So I get to tell stories about people who tell stories, or who are part of stories. And so there's always, it's not meta, but there's always kind of layers of narrative that are going on. Even if, in the case of The Old Man and Hemingway, it's very simple. You know, one of the lessons I learned with that film was that you don't need to do anything fancy. You just need to, you know, sit and listen, and then, you know, craft. When we get to Neither Memory Nor Magic, there's a lot more construction that takes place. You know, I mean, the other night we were talking about how I use Super 8 film to mimic archival footage. So that's a little detail of constructed reality. You know, I wanted to create a certain texture, and, you know, and I knew that if I used Super 8, you know, people would watch it and they would, you know, I had shot it at that time, but they would think it was 60 years old. With Betty Laflacca and the narrative, you know, and getting to Julieta Ramon and Betty Laflacca, you know, I'm definitely plunging into constructed reality. And Betty, you know, everything was very carefully constructed. The interior locations were all in one loft space. Very often, I mean, you look at it, a lot of times there's only one wall that we finished, you know, and so that's why you get these kind of Wes Anderson-like compositions, is because we didn't build 3 walls, we just had the one wall. In the bedroom at the end, when she walks in, there's one wall, there's like a bed, and then there's a door frame, right? So that's all you see. So there's nothing else other than what you see. It's just literally a door frame that you see. And if you watch the film again, when Betty comes home, leans on the door, the whole door frame kind of walks. I can see that because I was there and I know the reality. I also want to thank Ana Asensio, the actress that starred in Betty Laflacca. She may be watching. We were texting earlier. She was also the star of Julieta Ramon, one of my muses, and a beautiful person. And we were talking earlier today about how I sort of was working in this comic erotic genre with these films, and so it was reminded, like, yeah, that was pretty good for me. So you know, maybe the next film will be back in that vein, and it's not going to be serious. So we're getting close. I want to show one last slide. Can we show? Well, let me before we get to the slide. Okay, so making all these short films, narrative shorts, I'm making documentaries. 5 years ago, longer than that, but I have my friend Alan Hoffmanis heard about this action movie studio in Uganda, went there, found them, and became an action movie star in Uganda. And so he came back and he told me a story, and I was like, that's amazing. You know, that sounds like it would make a great documentary. And so 5 years ago, 5 years after I found out, my friend Catherine Zubek and I, we teamed up to go to Uganda to tell the story of Wakaliwood, Uganda's first action movie studio. And we could spend 2 hours just talking about that film, but we won't. But Isaac, the Ugandan director, who went from being a brick maker, he was making bricks in a swamp, and one day decided he was going to make action movies, and then made 40 action movies with no money. Isaac was a big fan of Charlie Chaplin, as was I. That was how I got into film to begin with. And so I took my Charlie Chaplin outfit to Uganda with me. And can we show this slide 7 now, that last slide? So that's me. This is the guys, the commandos from Wakaliwood. You know, so so we had spent 2 weeks filming with them, and you know, we were done filming. So I went back to visit them, and I put on my Chaplin outfit, and I walked out of, I was in my friend Alan's room. He lives there in the slum with them. And actually that doorway that you see behind me, I sort of walked out of that dressed as Chaplin. And they're always like kids from the neighborhood that are hanging out. As soon as I walked out, everybody, all the kids like fell to the floor laughing. And I started to do my little Chaplin walk, and they were just giggling and rolling. And it just gave me chills because I was doing the Chaplin shtick 40 years, you know, or I don't know, almost 100 years later. And it worked. And so Isaac shot like a little 2-minute thing with me. And so we agreed that when the documentary was done, I would go back, make a special trip just so that we could make a film where Charlie Chaplin fights commandos. It's Charlie Chaplin's Lost Africa film. So we haven't done that yet, but maybe when this whole COVID situation, you know, gets a little better, I'm gonna go back and make that film. So it all started with silent film, and as you can see, it kind of, you know, continues to be about silent film. And this whole, you know, all these anecdotes, everything I've been talking about, I think at the end of the day, it's about finding your voice, you know, following your muse, following your bliss, and figuring out, you know, how to tell the stories that you want to tell. I guess that's a good line to end on, and then we can open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, we've been getting some great audience questions. There's still time, audience members, to get your questions in. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type in your question. The first question is, hi, Mr. Perez. Thank you for being here with us today. I was wondering if you could speak to the movie Memories of Underdevelopment and describe how this film has impacted you and your career.
Well, I like this question very much. It's clearly a test to show if I really know what I'm talking about in terms of, and I do. This is one of my favorite movies, Memories of Underdevelopment, made in 1967. I think it's the greatest Cuban film of all time. It's a film that, it's kind of like a Cuban new wave film with a twist of Fellini, about a Cuban writer in the 60s who's, you know, trying to decide whether he should stay or he should go. And in the meantime, you know, having sexual adventures and just trying to navigate Cuba in the 60s. And I don't know, I mean, it's a film that I love and that's influenced me a lot, and that I think influences me more today, and the work that I'm contemplating making in the next few years. I'm jumping back into narrative now to make fiction films, and Memories of Underdevelopment is definitely, you know, I don't want to copy it or emulate it, but it's definitely an inspiration to me in terms of what you can do with the form.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Tony asks, how did Viggo Mortensen and Patricia Clarkson come to be involved with Neither Memory Nor Magic?
It's another good question. You know, the basic answer is one should be shameless and not be afraid of stalking people when you want them to be in your film. You know, so with Patty, it actually was not that hard, because a friend of mine was friends with a friend of hers. You know, so my friend Iona connected me to her friend who was very close friends with Patricia Clarkson. And I think, she agreed to meet me for dinner, and we talked about it, and she said yes. And she was so lovely to work with. Viggo, I stalked. There was a benefit for Chilean earthquake victims that he was going to be, participating in. Ariel Dorfman, the playwright, had put it together. And anyway, there's a whole story about how I got a ticket because it was sold out. Nobody could get tickets, but I got a ticket. And after the screening, I just went up to Viggo. I made a beeline for him. I knew he had a poetry press. I knew he was into poetry. I knew he knew Radnóti. And so I made a 2-minute elevator pitch. I gave him a DVD and said, hey, I'd like you to read Radnóti's poetry in my film. And that was it. Like, then everybody else came, swarmed him. And it was, so 9 months later, I'm lying on my couch on a Sunday afternoon. I get a phone call from a European phone number, and I answer, and is this Hugo? Yeah. Hey, it's Viggo. Do you still want me to read those poems? And I was like, yeah.
Nah.
And I hadn't finished the film yet, luckily, or I was just about to. And so he's like, I'm coming into New York in like 2 weeks. Let's do it then. And then we did it. I mean, there's a little bit more to it than that, but he was also incredibly great and generous. I'm a big fan of his, and I thought he was just perfect. And I thought his voice, the timbre of his voice, was really perfect.
It was wonderful.
Greg asks, Hugo, thank you for joining us. Being a big fan of Chaplin, have you revisited The Great Dictator during this 100th anniversary year and election season?
A great question. I have a copy of a bootleg DVD of The Great Dictator. It's up on my wall. I would need a ladder to get it because I've got a wall filled with stuff. But so in Uganda, they're always the guys that sell like bootleg Hollywood movies. So Chaplin was as hot as like whatever Hollywood movies, and people were selling bootlegs of Chaplin movies. I've got a bootleg The Great Dictator that's up on my wall right now. So I love that movie. I have revisited it several times in the last few years. I can't help but, just think about that film like all the time right now. That scene with Chaplin as the dictator and the beach ball globe.
And the globe.
Yeah. Yeah, as a little sidebar, a couple of years ago, I was given this award. I was randomly given this award by this Chinese film awards ceremony, and a friend, and I was like, this is kind of random, but sure, I'll accept the award. And so I asked my friends, like, what should I put in my award speech? And one of them said, you should put some of Chaplin's speech at the end of The Great Dictator. And so that was my acceptance speech for the award. As I gave, I don't know if you remember this impassioned plea for humanity, but it actually worked out really well. It's a strange event because it was at Symphony Hall here in New York. I was one of the few non-Asians, and I was the only non-Asian given an award. And so I'm up there, and there's 500 Asian faces staring at me, just wondering, what is this guy doing here? Why are we giving him an award? But they're very nice about it. So I gave my Chaplin speech, and it was very, nobody got the reference, but it was very satisfying to me.
We've had several questions about kind of how you view Cuba and America as someone who really straddles both cultures. So could you speak maybe just a bit more in general about what the difference between those two cultures are in how you experience them?
This is a complicated question to unpack. When I went to Cuba for the first time, it was emotionally, I won't say difficult for me, but it was a very emotional trip for me. And this is the country my family had fled. A number of my father, my grandfather, my uncle were political prisoners. So it's a country that economically is very challenged. And so when I went to, especially in the 90s, when I first visited Cuba, nobody had anything. But at the same time, the culture was so great. The family that I met for the first time and that I've become very close to since then, that I met has been great. The people that I met were great. Havana, even with its 70 years of deferred maintenance, is still one of the most amazing cities in the world for me. So it's very complicated. I don't have rose-tinted eyes about it. I mean, a lot of people go and they say, like, I hope it never changes. And then it's like, well, you may not want a Walmart here, but Cubans want a Walmart here because then they can go and buy all this stuff. So anyway, so it's very complicated. And so how do I feel about like the US embargo with Cuba? I feel, I mean, after I went for the first time, I just realized that it was, if the goal of the embargo was that it was going to somehow force Cuba to change, it's failed for the last 70 years. Interestingly, if, we live in a capitalist country, and if you listen, like Adam Smith, right, let the market decide. And I feel if people really wanted a regime change, they should lift the embargo and they should allow, business to proceed normally. There are various moments in the last 40 years of Cuban history where if the US had lifted the embargo, I feel like it would have resulted in a new government coming into power. Because anyway, so that's, I don't want to talk politics, it gets a little boring. But I feel, and I've gone to Cuba now, I don't know, over 50 times probably. And in the last 5 years before lockdown, I was going about 5 times a year for various projects. I mean, I always felt like whatever I was doing, whatever projects I was bringing, that cultural, if people want the country to change, the best way to do it is through cultural exchange. That's my personal belief. I know that many people, including people very close to me and close to my family, disagree with me, like, one of my dad's best friends, I made this documentary or produced a documentary for PBS, and he called me out on Facebook and said that my father and my grandfather were rolling in their graves at what I had done, so, but, I feel, everybody has to choose their own path, and I've chosen mine.
Yeah.
So Brittany has asked, your newest film, Once Upon a Time in Uganda, was scheduled to be a part of this year's South by Southwest Film Festival. Could you talk about your experience of having your world premiere affected by the festival's cancellation due to COVID-19? And more importantly, how can audiences see the film in the future?
That gets into like a wonky film distribution conversation. My co-director, Catherine Zubek, and I, when South by Southwest was canceled, and it was clear that, film festivals as we were familiar with them were not going to happen for a while, we pulled the film, we pulled the world premiere, decided to make use of the time to go back into the edit room, make some tweaks to the film. And we decided basically to kind of hold the film, do some work on it until we could premiere the film in real life, IRL, as they say. So, hopefully that can happen sometime in fall of 2021. But, we'll see. We'll see how we're doing in 12 months. So as soon as we know where we're going to world premiere and where the film will be available, I'll let you guys know, and you can let other people know. But I mean, some people decided that they were going to do the digital, festival circuit, and for us that just didn't make sense. So we're kind of waiting until we can kind of do it the old-fashioned way.
Jessica, could I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
Yeah, could you just say a few words about the movie for people who, because it was one of the ones we were actually hoping, you would be showing it at South by Southwest so that we could show it here when you came, when we thought you were coming in March or April.
I touched on it just briefly at the very end of my remarks. Once Upon a Time in Uganda is the story of Uganda's first action movie studio, Hollywood. If you Google it, you'll pull up lots of fun stuff. Their most famous film is Who Killed Captain Alex, which is a classic. And Isaac Nabwana is the director of the studio and the director of the films. And I mentioned before that, he was just a guy who was making bricks for a living, and he dreamed about making action movies. And then he decided, I'm going to do it. And he sold, I don't know how many thousands of bricks to buy his first camera, and got his family and his friends to be in his first film. And then people realized, like, wait a second, he can actually do it. And built up this kind of following in Uganda. They'd make these movies, they'd burn them onto DVD, and then they'd sell the DVDs in the local markets. That was their distribution network. And then they started to post a couple of trailers on YouTube. And my friend Alan, who's a serious film nerd, he saw these trailers and felt like, this is awesome. And he went, and when he came back, he said, Hugo, I'm an action movie star now. And,
so fantastic.
And then he went back and moved in with them and became like their in-house producer, and was in a few of the films, but really helped promote them to the rest of the world to such an extent that one of their more recent films, Crazy World, had its world premiere at the Toronto Film Festival last year. It was one of the closing night films at the Toronto Film Festival. And for people that don't know, Toronto is one of the world's most important festivals. And, so it's a big deal. And also a few months before that, MoMA had screened a few of Isaac's films, Museum of Modern Art in New York. So anyways, it's crazy. It's one of the most fun. I've worked on a lot of fun things. I can't complain. But this was really an amazing thing, and it was like for Catherine Zubek and I, it was such a great experience, and it's devastating, when weeks before our world premiere, the world shuts down. Everything was, we were on track to have a very nice world premiere at South by, and then, I should be on a Caribbean island right now, at some weird little film festival on a beach, drinking margaritas, and that didn't happen, I mean, I don't know if you, like, once you premiere your film, then you spend like 12 months traveling. And so Catherine and I were really excited that, like, we're going to get to, now, we're going to get to have fun traveling with the film. So I hope that will happen. It's just going to be delayed.
All right, I think we have time for two more questions. The first is from Nicholas. He would like to know if you have any plans to work on any more comedic films.
Well, as a matter of fact, the answer to that is yes. And I am imminently going to begin shooting an improvised feature film that will have no script, and that's going to be done with no budget and a handful of actors in like a week. So I'm following Isaac's model in Uganda for action movies. I was like, well, if he could do that, then I can certainly make a movie with no action sequences in it in like a week. And so I'm working on the concept is that it's kind of like a COVID comedy. It's kind of like Woody Allen's Manhattan with coronavirus. So everybody's like saying, oh, we can't show masks, and it's like, well, they're here, so let's can we make it funny? I don't know, I feel it's important. I mean, as much as to acknowledge the tragedy of this moment, it's also important, that we're still living and, through this, and that there's a lot of humor and just like the weird little, how do people go on dates during COVID? How do masks affect certain things? doing a little bit of research, I learned that apparently COVID porn is very hot
Yeah.
right
I know, it's hysterical.
It's like that's become like a fetish now. And I'm like, you know what? That's that would be good in a film. So
There's the hand washing subgenre as well.
Well, Joan, I'm not going to ask how you know that, but yeah. Whoa. Yeah, so the answer is yes. I'm going to work on some more comedic stuff.
That's great. All right, so the final question is from Ava. So she asks, has there ever been something that interested you as a potential documentary subject that you felt you couldn't construct around? That is to say, The Old Man in Hemingway was a beautiful short. Have you ever run into anything that's piqued your interest like that, but that you haven't known how to build onto yet?
Oh, that's a difficult question. So I think the short answer is, in terms of what I've done, now, like I've always found a way to construct around the subject. Sometimes it's challenging. There are, however, a number of projects that I started and never finished. There was one project I started about a speakeasy bookstore in New York City run by this guy, Michael Seidenberg, Brazen Head Books. Brazen Head Books is one of the greatest places I've ever known. And Michael was one of the greatest guys I've ever known. And he created this weird little space where, weirdos, and I count myself in that group, like literary weirdos who were really into books and hanging out late at night could gather. And so I sort of, partly when I met him, I started to work on a short documentary about Brazen Head Books and about him. And then at a certain point, I just wanted to experience the place. And, I just wanted to be there and not have a camera. So I shot quite a bit. I never edited it. Michael passed away last year. And since then, I've been thinking that as an homage to him, I need to finish that film, and I have some ideas for how to do it. So I guess the answer is that sometimes it's just the timing is not right, but that eventually, if you kick an idea around long enough, you'll find a way to build around it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Do you have any final comments, Hugo or Joan?
I touched on this before, as in my sort of previous closing remarks, that, so much of this has to do with finding my voice, and finding my voice or your voice or anybody's voice. I mean, that's kind of a lifelong endeavor. And, once you found it, your voice is not just, it's not just, like my ability to be able to tell stories and talk to people, but it's how to translate what's in my head or the things that interest me into a form, that people can appreciate. And I would just say, for anybody that's an aspiring filmmaker out there, or any kind of filmmaker, is that just stay true to the things that what are the things that you love or that interest you? What are the things that excite you? What are the things that intrigue you? And even if they're not the cool things, even if they're not, a lot of things I'm interested in are things that will never be funded, because, they don't have the right kind of, they don't deal with social issues. They don't deal with topics that people are interested in supporting. But, I found a way to, basically by not making any money, to keep doing what I love to do, and to follow my bliss. Yeah, so just, do the things that you love. That was, Albert Maysles, he would often say to me that, don't make a film about something you don't love. And he was like, every film I've ever worked on, I love my subjects. and I feel like I'm in collaboration with them, you know, and I think that shows in his work. You know, you see the work, and you can tell that he had a relationship. I mean, this is also for fiction film. If you're making a film, work with people that you like, or that you admire and that admire you. You know, it's you know, avoid avoid strife.
It's
Well.
wonderful to have you here. I'm so glad you were able to come.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm sad. You know, when I was going to do this in person, I was going to get a tour. I guess, is it the Masters and Johnson collection?
The Kinsey, it's
Yeah,
the Alfred Kinsey.
collection. So I was promised a tour of the Dirty Postcard collection.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm very sad that I, you know, now this week apparently also Star Trek Voyager's Captain Janeway is very nerdy, but she got a statue in Bloomington, Indiana.
Oh,
You
wow.
know, you guys even know this?
No, I didn't know this. It's
Yeah, so this is like
fantastic.
kind of the only female starship captain, who's very cool, and her character, I mean, that character got a statue in Bloomington. So anyway, hopefully in the future I'll get to come in person. But thank you guys for having me. It's really been a pleasure. And I guess the short films, including one I didn't talk about, Seed, those are all available for a couple of weeks if people want to see them or watch them again.
Yeah, and that link is in the chat for everybody to check out. Also, I believe we have it up on our website for this event. So thank you to Hugo, Joan, and all of you again for being with us. I'd like to thank the entire IU Cinema team, and particularly Elena, Will, David, Brittany, and Ava, who've all worked behind the scenes to help make this event possible. We'd like to encourage you to go to IU Cinema's virtual screening room to see our other events and offerings, including the currently running Dead, a comedy perfect for Halloween, and Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President, a documentary following the former president's tight bond with musicians Willie Nelson, the Allman Brothers, Bob Dylan, and others. To all of you who tuned in, thank you once again for being with us. Be well and be kind to yourselves and others during these challenging times. Thank you all so much and have a great night.